US President Donald Trump has mentioned the possibility of regime change in Iran. He mentioned the prospect in a post on social media. It comes after US airstrikes on Iran's nuclear facilities. Trump says the Iranian nuclear program has been obliterated, but the UN's Atomic Agency chief says it's not possible to properly assess the damage.
Satellite images show the Iranian nuclear site Fordo before and after it was struck. These are believed to be the entrance holes of 2 US bombs known as bunker busters, capable of penetrating up to 60 meters below the surface. Fordo is built deep inside a mountain. In central Iran, these images show the Isfahan nuclear site before and after it was struck by Tomahawk missiles launched from a US submarine. US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth says the mission, codenamed Operation Midnight Hammer, devastated the Iranian nuclear program. He also maintains the attack was not aimed at toppling the Iranian government.
This mission was not and has not been about regime change. The president authorized a precision operation to neutralize the threats to our national interests posed by the Iranian nuclear program and the collective self-defense of our troops and our ally Israel.
Iran responded to the attacks on its nuclear sites by firing a barrage of missiles at Israel. Most were shot down, but some got through, causing extensive damage in the cities of Haifa and Tel Aviv, where this banner appeared thanking Donald Trump for striking Iran. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi condemned the attack.
There is no red line that they have not crossed. I don't know how much room is left for diplomacy. We are now calculating the damages.
In Tehran, hundreds took to the streets to protest against the US strikes. Among the protesters was the Iranian president, who has sworn not to let the US go unpunished.
Janelle Dumalaon is in Washington for us. Janelle, welcome. Trump is now mentioning regime change. Is the US enlarging its mission after all?
Now, let's get into the text of that Truth Social post. If you'll allow me to read, it says, "It's not politically correct to use the term regime change, but if the current Iranian regime is unable to make Iran great again, why wouldn't there be a regime change? MEGA 3 exclamation points." Now, that is noteworthy, Nahal, because it comes after a day where his administration officials have really taken pains to tell the world that what happened in Iran was a limited operation with a very specific goal, that specific goal being to curb Iran's abilities to make a nuclear bomb. So it was in that report that ran ahead of me just now. You had Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth saying this was and has not been about regime change. You have Vice President J.D. Vance going on American TV News saying that the U.S. rather is not at war with Iran. Rather, the U.S. is at war with Iran's nuclear program. Now, really, we know that it really has been Israeli leadership that has been looking at regime change as a favorable outcome, with Israeli leader Benjamin Netanyahu saying that removing Supreme Leader Khamenei could, quote, end the war. But back to the Truth Social post. Does this really mean that the U.S. is enlarging its mission? Not necessarily per se. Just because he posted that doesn't mean that this is what he is trying to do. There is a distinctly trollish tone to that post, if you have noticed. But certainly people will be asking themselves whether Trump is at least mentally open to the idea of deepening U.S. involvement in the conflict in Iran. And that is noteworthy, not just because of all this messaging we've seen around the limited nature of this operation, but because forever wars are pretty unpopular, broadly speaking, with the American people. And President Trump might find that the more he talks about regime change, the more people are going to draw parallels to the war in Iraq and what happened there.
Speaking of the American people, how are Trump's supporters in the U.S. reacting to this?
Well, now really it depends on who you ask. So just to refresh the memory of our viewers, there was a split within Trump's coalition. So on the one hand, you had those who were attracted to Trump's sort of anti-interventionist position, his promise to extricate the U.S. From foreign war. So in that camp, you had the likes of a former advisor, Steve Bannon, you had lawmaker Marjorie Taylor Greene, you had conservative commentator Tucker Carlson. And in the other camp, you had those who said, well, you know, President Donald Trump has a window here within which he could end Iran's nuclear ambitions. That's a window that he should take. So you have, for example, Senator Lindsey Graham in that category. Now that it's happened and the U.S. has joined Israel's war on Iran, you know, we have been seeing some of the reactions. They're mixed, but it's worth noting that the Republicans have been largely supportive, with the likes of House Speaker Mike Johnson saying that the president made the correct call. We did, however, hear from one anti-interventionist voice, and Steve Bannon. He said that he did criticize Trump's remarks after the strike, saying that they were too open-ended for his taste. And you also have the likes of Republican Thomas Massie, who perhaps came out with the strongest remarks, saying that he thought this was unconstitutional, incidentally a position that he shares with many of the Democrats who are incensed that Trump did not consult Congress before authorizing those strikes on Iran.
Well, Trump now also says that it is up to Iran to agree to an end to this war. Do we have some sense of what would come next?
You know, we do not know what comes next. This is just one of the many open questions, all of them important, and all of the answers kind of depend on each other. So another important question is whether Iran will retaliate, in what form, and what kind of response that could potentially provoke from the U.S. There's also this question of how damaged Iran's nuclear program is and how it will react. Are the strikes going to be the sort of event where Iran will be then forced to the negotiating table, as Trump is publicly saying is his calculus, or will it be the sort of event that causes them to double down and increase their motivation to obtain a nuclear bomb in the case that they are still in fact able to do that? There's also this question of whether a deal could realistically be made between Iran and the U.S. Is there trust still in the U.S. At a time where surprise attacks came parallel to Donald Trump saying that he was allowing for more time for a diplomatic solution to emerge? So what comes next is just one of those many questions, and I suspect the answers will not all come at the same time.
That's DW's Janelle Dumalaon in Washington. Thank you so much. I'm joined now by Alex Vatanka. He is a senior fellow and the founding director of the Iran program at the Middle East Institute in Washington. Alex, welcome to our show. The U.S. president has mentioned the possibility of regime change in Iran. How possible is that?
Well, at this point, I'm not sure if I want to take President Trump's words seriously. I think he's just basically trying to put pressure on the officials in Tehran so they don't do anything that would upset President Trump. Obviously, what I'm talking about here is Iranian retaliation to the American attack on their nuclear facilities. That's what I think he's doing, to sort of trying to remind the Iranians that if they do hit U.S. bases or other American interests, then he might do what he had always said he wouldn't do, which is to look for ways to maybe bring the Iranian regime down. Remember, as we just heard in the segment before, President Trump is known for calling these wars in the Middle East, in Iraq and elsewhere in the last couple of decades as some of the dumbest things American presidents have done. And here he is, sort of toying with the idea that he might engage in one, which would be by far the biggest one. So right now, I think he's just trying to put pressure on the Iranian regime. There is certainly no sense here in Washington that anything serious in terms of planning has happened to suggest that regime change is seriously being considered.
Would it be your assessment that there has been a blow politically in Iran after the U.S. strikes?
Look, the Iranian regime spent decades pursuing an ideological foreign policy centered on anti-Americanism and obviously its known position on Israel, which was purely ideological. It didn't serve Iranian national interest. And the bigger crime, if you will, has been not preparing the country for such a fight. So we've seen now, other than the ballistic missiles, the Iranian military is not in a position to do anything in this war, because this is not a war that Iran remembers from the Iran-Iraq war, which was basically, ground troops fighting it out. This is a very different war, a war the Iranian authorities have not prepared their armed forces or their country for. So absolutely, there's a huge debate, I'm sure, inside of Iran. We pick it up, even though internet is down in Iran, we're still picking up. There is a policy fight that Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader, and the Revolutionary Guards have recklessly brought the country to this point, and it's not time to engage or continue to engage in brinkmanship and speak of retaliation and so forth. It's time to have a hard look and change course before the country of Iran, never mind the regime, but the country of Iran, starts paying a heavier price than it already has paid in this conflict.
I'd like to go deeper into the debate within Iran, and this is your assessment, of course. The Iranian regime is threatening major retaliation. Do you think it will follow through and risk further escalation with the US?
Look, we don't really know the state of the decision-making process in Iran. We assume, obviously, it still exists, even as Supreme Leader Khamenei is, hiding somewhere, fearing the, assassins from Mossad. But we assume that he's still in touch. That seems to be the case. I mean, there were reports here in the US that he's even gone ahead and chosen some potential successors should he be killed. So the decision-making process is going through a lot of trouble, but it hasn't entirely broken down. The question, though, is what is the balance in that decision-making process among the so-called hardliners and the more pragmatic forces that we know exist in Iran? Why do we know that? Because that's been known for years. If I may very quickly, the Islamic Republic has had two main factions when it comes to foreign policy. People around Khamenei, the Revolutionary Guards, who believed in that ideological mission of fighting the United States and Israel. Right now, they really don't have a case that they can defend. They are severely damaged, and there is no way they're going to come out of this conflict, regardless how it ends, looking good. The other faction, the pragmatic faction, has always said, why are we fighting the Americans for? Why are we so obsessing about Israel? Why don't we change course? I don't know who's going to have the upper hand in that debate. But if there is such a debate, one has to hope then that the pragmatic forces will come to their senses and argue for things that says, let's talk to the Americans, let's give up enrichment. They don't have to come out with a white flag, but they need to sit and talk to the Americans. Unfortunately, we did not hear that from Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi today in Turkey. It's tough. I understand they just got hit by two nuclear states. It's really difficult for them to back down. But if Iran wants to save itself against such an unpredictable man as Donald Trump, it really doesn't have time. It needs to talk to him, and it needs to make some concessions to save the country, if you will.
Does Iran have any economic measures to put pressure on the US?
Not really. I mean, the countries really barely trade with one another. We're talking somewhere between $50 to $100 million a year in the last few decades, so not much. Iran's biggest trading partner is China, and countries nearby like the United Arab Emirates, Iraq, Turkey. The Russians have become a trading partner of sorts, $4 to $5 billion a year in the last few years. But the United States is not there. Among the Europeans, you have the Germans, French, Italians, among the top trading partners. But again, we're talking a few billions of dollars. Nobody in Europe or in the West compares to what China buys or sells to Iran. What Iran could do to hurt U.S. interests, if that's what they choose to do, is essentially try and damage or take hostage the regional economy as much as they can. Again, 20-25% of the world's oil comes out of the Strait of Hormuz. Iran hasn't shut it. But I don't know if that's what they want to do, because that's escalation. And I'm not sure if that's going to be necessarily the choice they're going to make, because escalation means counter-escalation, and you have to wonder if Iran is ready for that.
We'll leave it there. Thank you so much. Alex Vatanka, Senior Fellow and the Founding Director of the Iran Program at the Middle East Institute in Washington. Thank you. We can now speak to Holly Dagres. She is a Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute with special focus on Iran. Holly, thank you so much for your time. The Iranian regime is threatening major retaliation. Do you think it will follow through and risk further escalation with the US?
Well, analysts like myself had always said if the U.S. was to strike Iran's nuclear facilities, we'd see it retaliate. And so what does that look like? it looks like an array of things. It would be attack on U.S. forces in the region, potentially this closing of the Strait of Hormuz, cyber attacks, as your colleague noted. Of course, the proxies in the region being activated, though in the post-October 7th world, they've been maimed. There's also the worry about dual and foreign citizens being taken hostage in Iran. And of course, another item would be the issue of transnational repression of dissidents and U.S. former officials. Now, in this climate that we're seeing, this is, of course, nothing that any analyst could have predicted, this war that we're in now. And it's really hard to say how the Iranians will retaliate, because right now they're in a fight for their survival. They've lost a lot of military brass at the top. Their military and nuclear facilities have been hit. And it just is looking very bleak for them right now. So if they were to respond in any way, it really would then meet with a response from the United States beyond the nuclear program. So I think this is something they're calculating right now.
The US president has mentioned the possibility of regime change in Iran. What's your take on that?
Well, believe it or not, President Donald Trump's tweet, which you mentioned earlier, is not something new during this war. We actually started hearing the conversation about regime change from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who put out a video calling on Iranians to rise up and change the regime. And of course, this operation's name, Rising Lion, is actually not just a biblical reference, but it harkens back to pre-1979 under the Shah. And some of the symbolism and imagery is the lion and sun that's being used by the Israeli government, which is found on the de facto Iranian flag and a symbol of Iranian nationalism. So I think there's a lot of messaging about regime change coming from the Israelis before there was from President Donald Trump.
Could Iran count on any tangible support from any of its neighbors?
Well, as I noted earlier, many of its proxies have been maimed post-October 7th, and one of its top regional allies, the Bashar al-Assad regime in Syria, was toppled in December. So Iran is very much alone in this moment, and I think this is a big reality check for the Islamic Republic, that because of its actions for the past 46 years, this is where it's brought them to, where they don't have any friends or allies to really back them up except in words.
Now, Iran says its foreign minister will hold talks with the Russian president in Moscow on Monday. What do you expect to see come out of that meeting?
Well, Russian President Vladimir Putin has been very much interested in breaking talks between the U.S. and Iran even before this war began. And I imagine he will be trying to play a mediator for some sort of ceasefire. But it really depends on how the Iranians respond, which they have threatened that they will do. So if the Iranians respond, I'm not exactly sure where we go from there if there's no off-ramp.
That's Holly Dagres, Iran analyst at the Washington Institute. Thank you so much for your time.
And I'm now joined in the studio by Hans-Jakob Schindler. He's a security expert and senior director of the Counter-Extremism Project. So very good to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
And we just heard the Iranian foreign minister there basically saying that Iran has the right to self-defense and take any action that they find suitable at this moment. What type of action do you expect Tehran to take next?
Well, there are various scenarios. I mean, first of all, the US administration, every single high-ranking official from the president to vice president to the Minister of Defense, Secretary of State, all said this is a one-off. We're not wanting war against Iran. We're warning Iran to respond. But the Islamic Republic has been really taking a pummeling. Of course, they miscalculated by dismissing the 3 European foreign ministers a couple of days ago in Geneva out of hand and say we're not ready to negotiate. That, really was the prelude to what we saw last night. But they will have to respond in some kind. So there is, of course, the Strait of Hormuz. They don't need to close it. They just need to fire a couple of international tankers. And then Lloyd's of London will ramp up the insurance that it's nearly commercially inviable to get oil or gas out of it. There's, of course, US bases in Iraq. That would actually be the better option. This is the Soleimani response, where they essentially informed the Americans that they're going to shoot to make sure that Americans died, but that there is a visible response that they could sell at home. And then, of course, there's international terrorism. They have a clear history of doing that. They killed a busload of Israeli tourists in Burgas, Bulgaria in 2012. We have seen ramping up of Iranian intelligence operations all over Europe in the last couple of months. They have made contact with criminal organizations, both in Spain as well in other countries in Europe, to target their own opposition politicians, but also, criminals don't care who they kill. So that is also an option. That's the three scenarios that they have. Beyond that, Hamas and Hezbollah are down. The Houthis are willing but clearly incapable and have their own ceasefire agreement with the United States. That's the only options they really have.
Well, those three options that you outlined are already enough to make everybody a little bit nervous. How is Israel? Israel is saying already it's preparing for a prolonged conflict there. And how is the US going to react to that? Or how do they try and prevent it?
Well, preventing you can only do, force protection has been increased, of course, of US forces and installations in the Gulf. The American side is making very clear that they're going to respond very forcefully should Iran respond. That's pretty much all you can do. Of course, the Israeli side cannot stop. Number one, these were key installations, but this is not the nuclear program in its entirety in Iran, which was destroyed. And secondly, the price of having a military operation against a nuclear program is that should the regime survive, you have a virtual guarantee that they're now going for the bomb and that they're not going to do this via the EIAO is allowed to inspect their nuclear sites. So you have to virtually try to get a different political constellation in Iran. Unfortunately, in this situation, no one has a plan how that's supposed to be achieved. So you're going to have to continue with airstrikes.
Israel already said that its attacks eventually could lead to the fall of the Iranian regime, while the US, today in the press conference, Pete Hegseth pointed out that that wasn't the aim of the attacks we saw last night. But is there anything to it? How vulnerable is the regime?
Well, the regime is, of course, on the one hand, incredibly weak, politically, militarily, especially economically after the sanctions of the last decades. But it's also, as far as the internal stability is concerned, so far, as far as we can see, quite cohesive. Right? No dissent among the Revolutionary Guards, no dissent among the army or the police or the top leadership. At this point, it depends on how long they can take these strikes before maybe there is some internal dissent. But the opposition is not well organized, definitely not armed. There is no leader or program or common vision of the opposition in Iran, except that they all don't like the Islamic Republic. And this regime is not going to ride into the sunset without defending itself. And the structure within Iran that has the highest chance of survival of any kind of dissent or internal strife are the Revolutionary Guards, which are not the most liberal part of the Iranian regime.
So what chances are there for any kind of diplomacy? Is that out of the window?
Not 100%. Look, there is rational choices that each side could do. Israel could basically say at one point in the next couple of days, okay, we've done enough damage. This nuclear program is postponed for many years. The Americans could say, we've done what the Israelis couldn't do. We are not really interested to get any more involved. And if there are not significant strikes against US installations, we'll leave it at that. In the Islamic Republic could say, okay, we'll take it. But of course, then try to rebuild the program and survive as a regime. The problem with the Middle East is rational choices are usually in short supply in these kind of situations.
Well, Hans-Jakob Schindler, the Senior Director of the Counter-Extremism Project. Thank you so very much for your time.
Thanks so much for having me.